Throughout the brief history of the internet and philosophy, I don't believe there's been a more misunderstood concept than the Hegelian dialectic. And to be fair, I can understand why. Many people want to get into leftist politics, get into Marx, and at some point along their journey decide to undertake the beast that is G.W.F. Hegel. Many people have this idea in their minds that the Hegelian dialectic is some kind of final boss of philosophy. Once you've unlocked it and can master it, you can bend reality to your will or whatever. The problem is, Hegel is hard, very hard, so you go onto the internet to find help and the resources you'll get aren't the best. People want an easy answer to a very complex topic. These resources can come in many different forms. Marx is talking about dialectics, video essays on games like Fallout New Vegas, or in this case, a Homestuck analysis. Back in October of 2022, Funk McLovin put out a video titled Homestuck Dialectics, Homestuck Philosophy, with the thumbnail being Hegel but John Egbert-ified. As someone who not only likes Homestuck but also the 18th century German philosopher Hegel, a very exclusive group of people I belong to, I clicked on it and it's slop. There are a lot of problems with Funk McLovin's understanding of Hegel. In fact, I would say there's more she gets wrong than she gets right. Matter of fact, I would be hesitant to claim that she gets any of it right. I've been sitting on a response video to Funk McLovin's video for a while now, and at the moment I'm working on an incredibly long Twin Peaks video, sort of an explain whilst we watch type of thing. So I thought it could be a good excuse to bring this video into reality as a short, filler episode so the algorithm won't decide that it hates me. Couple disclaimers. One, I'm 20 now. I was going to say 19, but I'm 20 now. I'm not a Hegel scholar. Don't take my video as fact. Do your own research. Read The Science of Logic. And I'm sorry if my audio sounds strange, reverberated, or echoey. I've just moved into a new house and the ceiling in my room is unironically like double my height. I've measured on my phone and the room is roughly 11.4 feet high. That's 3.5 meters. So if it seems to be a problem, I'll try and fix it in the future. But for now, I don't have a means of doing that. So the video begins with a picture of Kaiser from Fallout New Vegas. There's a very famous meme about him talking about Hegelian dialectics. Do you know anything about Hegel, then you might also have a sinking feeling in your stomach, knowing where this is about to go.
Hegel's dialectic is very specific. Dialectics, or dialectical arguments, are formed when two competing theses, or ideas broadly, are pitted against one another. They are arbitrarily the thesis and antithesis. When a thesis and antithesis, both are arbitrary and interchangeable but necessarily related, come into conflict, they inevitably produce something new.
Immediately, Funk McLovin makes an error in her explanation, but to be honest, it's a mistake that many people make, to the point that the mistake is recited as fact. You know, maybe the Patriots might have had a point in Metal Gear Solid 2. The Hegelian dialectic is not a thesis-antithesis synthesis. Funk McLovin uses an example which I will let them explain.
I might say the sky is blue. We'll call that the thesis. But you might disagree and say the sky is gray. We'll call that the antithesis. We have two seemingly mutually exclusive claims that need to be reconciled. This reconciliation is called synthesis.
If there were to be a synthesis of these two ideas, if you were to synthesize them, you would end up with the sky is a bluey grey, which is something new as Funk McLovin proclaimed. However, it isn't true. You're just mixing ideas together, finding a middle ground, and look, we've done dialectics. There isn't actually anything to be learnt here. Let me use an example to show how useless this idea of thesis-antithesis synthesis truly is. I say that Dave Strider is a boy, thesis. You say Dave Strider is a girl, antithesis. Dave Strider is non-binary, synthesis. Great, nothing has been accomplished here. And we've actually ended up at an incorrect position according to Canon Homestuck. I'm sure AO3 has some different opinions on that. Funk McLovin claims that through this method we can understand a more complete picture of reality. Yet we've just synthesized a false answer. Is this a more complete picture of reality? Funk McLovin even brings up this problem but doesn't touch on it further. If the new thesis, which is sometimes blue and sometimes grey, was pitted against the sky is green, would a synthesis not also include the sky is also sometimes green, which isn't true as the sky isn't green? There's a couple of major critiques to be had with this understanding of dialectics. Firstly is that the Hegelian dialectic cannot be formalized, it can only be seen in action. Hegel himself argues against this formalization of dialectics in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. What Hegel is trying to do is reach absolute truth. If you are attaching a preferred method to this search for truth, then you are sullying your efforts. Hegel calls for a zero-tolerance policy on presuppositions in his work. This is a problem he had with Kant's writing and is at the core of his method. If we are presupposing a correct method for analysis, then we are making a misstep. We're making external reflections. Hegel wants to deal with philosophy as such. Take the first chapter of the Science of Logic, for example, starting with being. Being isn't chosen at random or picked out because we want it to fit nicely as a thesis against the antithesis of nothingness. Even more so, as the antithesis to being would be more aptly non-being rather than nothing. Nothing is brought against being as it would be derived from being, not because it's an antithesis to being. When you think of pure being and you think of its contentlessness, you will derive nothing. You're simply following a train of thought set in motion by being, i.e. the antithesis, quote-unquote, is already present within the thesis, not a secondary concept we've haphazardly thrown into the mix. If we were to apply the methodology of thesis-antithesis synthesis to chapter 1 of the Science of Logic, it would read something like this: being, thesis, non-being, antithesis, being and a non-being, synthesis. What does this tell us exactly? Sure, we've skipped most of chapter 1 and 2 to understand what negation is, but would you even know? We don't gain anything from this, and this is why Hegel's immanent critique is so revolutionary, because the concepts drive their own investigation. They are their own tool of analysis, and that is how Hegel reaches truth. Presuppositions, external reflections, they're all thrown out of the window to deal with the content as such. The second critique is that thesis-antithesis synthesis is not even Hegel. This triad comes from another German philosophy called Fichte, and his method, for whatever reason, has been mimetically ascribed to Hegel, though it is a lot more deeper and nuanced than just thesis-antithesis synthesis. And like those freaky AIs from Metal Gear Solid 2 said, some memes don't die out like they should. Funk McLovin then goes on to give a real-world example of how dialectics would play out.
Two hypothetical political parties. One party, let's call them A, has the belief that society can be made better with a decrease in freedom and an increase in social programs. Another party, B, has the belief that society can be made better with an increase in personal freedom and a decrease in social programs. The synthesis, then, is that the ideals of personal freedom and social good are not mutually exclusive, and individuality can be preserved while still adhering to a greater social whole.
It's a nice little thought pattern that doesn't really have anything to do with the real world. Here, let me give another example. Political party A wants to throw trans people into labor camps. Thesis. Whilst political party B thinks that throwing trans people into labor camps isn't that great of an idea. If we were to synthesize these 2 points, we would get the right way, and that is unfortunately to throw some trans people into labor camps. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Thesis-antithesis synthesis often brings out absurd and wrong results. You have no way of proving the validity of either premise using this method, nor do you have a way to ensure that the later thesis that will come against your synthesized thesis isn't just some slop you've cooked up. And furthermore, it strips Hegel's philosophy of its revolutionary edge, providing us with some half-baked, enlightened centrist positions.
By exploring a supposed inconsistency between two statements, you can reach a greater truth. I like to think of it as cross-examining reality.
What is the inconsistency in being a nothing? That one is and one is not? How would that logically lead you to becoming, unless you already knew that the sublation of being a nothing would create becoming? What greater truth are we actually reaching here?
The synthesis of theses is so often revolution.
Says who? Is there a justification for this claim, or is it just thrown out there? If the revolution was a synthesis, then what on earth could the thesis and antithesis be? Take the capitalist mode of production, for example. Thesis capitalism, antithesis communism, synthesis social democracy. You don't need a revolution for social democracy. Would it not be more apt to say that the revolution is the driving force or conflict to create a new synthesis? If not, then what would the antithesis be to revolution once the synthesis becomes the new thesis? No revolution? Synthesized into a bit of revolution? It's nonsensical and altogether not Hegelian.
Prospect and Durst of the Medium offer us a very classical example of thesis and antithesis. Prospect, the good guys; Durst, the bad guys. But with a closer look, things aren't what they seem.
By pointing out that things aren't as black and white as they seem, pun intended, have you not also undermined your point that they are both thesis and antithesis? He does go on to state that the true oppressor, and I assume antithesis, is the king, but again, doesn't go anywhere.
What I find striking about WV's uprising is how similar it is to revolutions of the past in real life. He's a charismatic, somewhat reluctant hero, striking out against his oppressors on his own terms, setting aside the aesthetic for a greater purpose.
Funk McLovin claims that the Wayward Vagabond's revolution has striking similarities to revolutions of the past because of his charismatic personality, which is some great man of history slop if I'm being honest. The Russian Revolution did not come to fruition because Lenin was a really good public speaker. The revolution came to a reality because contradictions within Russian society had been sharpened to such a point that it was seeming to burst, and in a moment of crisis, the Bolsheviks managed to capitalize on this. If Lenin was not alive, the revolution would have still happened. Maybe in a different way or in different forms, but the mass of workers united together wouldn't have just disappeared.
Our enemies are not rednecks or SJWs, they're the smiling, grinning politicians in positions of power. They're the businessmen who rig the game once they've won it. We all know this, across political divides. But the issue is, we are divided and compartmentalized by our own social preferences. We have to overcome this to get anywhere, otherwise our time is spent fighting with each other. The reconciliation, the synthesis between our states, is populism.
This is straying from Hegel here and mostly delving into the works of Karl Marx. And I agree with the sentiment, however, a synthesis does not give the revolutionary potential that Funk McLovin is alluding to here. To understand why Hegel's work have such a revolutionary potential, and why they were picked up by arguably the most revolutionary man in history, a better understanding of the concept of sublation is needed. Sublation, or in German, aufheben, is to abolish and preserve one or many concepts. Let's see this in action to get a better grasp. The interests of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are in opposition to one another. The communist revolution would not synthesize these two concepts, but instead abolish them both, done through the destruction of aspects of society which constitute, form, and maintain said class positions. Commodity production, wage labor. The communist revolution will not only abolish the bourgeoisie, but it will also abolish the proletariat. Whilst this seems like pure negation, both proletariat and bourgeoisie are preserved through their non-being, in whatever people will be called post-revolution. We could not arrive at this position of communist society without first having the contradictory interests of proletarians and the bourgeoisie. We preserve other aspects of capitalism within communism, such as revolutions in machinery and production. They are altered, however, to resolve the contradiction they posed within the capitalist mode of production. Although it should be stated that using Marx as an example of sublation could be disputed, as it's not entirely clear if communism necessarily posits capitalism as an immediate determinacy, but we are kind of off track here. Do you see how this gives us a much fuller understanding of why these things happen and what will happen to them when we actually use Hegel rather than shoving them together in a synthesis? You can also go backwards with this, seeing what capitalism has preserved and negated from the feudal mode of production. Funk McLovin then goes on to analyze Dirk and Frisker using the non-Hegelian method. I think this is so far removed from Hegel that I don't really think it's worth covering, if I'm being fully honest. It's just throwing around the word antithesis to explain unresolved issues in both the characters' lives.
Personally, I think that dialectics can be incomplete. Not everything can be solved with synthesis, nor should everything be solved with it.
Really? You think the flawed method of another philosopher doesn't paint a great picture for Hegel? It's not Hegel. This entire video was shot in the foot by Funk McLovin not understanding Hegel, and then having the gall to critique Hegel for coming up with a dialectical formula that he didn't come up with. Brings up the point that the thesis may not be authentic, which is a point I already touched on, but you wouldn't know that without external reflections, whilst Hegel's method is one free of this and rigorously self-analytical.
Going back to the beginning, my example of the blue sky dialectic. Some madman might posit, in either bad faith or insanity, that the sky is in fact chartreuse at all times, and any contrary statement is false. If we employ synthesis here, it becomes impossible. Not only are our conclusions about the sky and this thesis contradictory, but they're mutually exclusive. There is no synthesis to be reached. It must be discarded.
Funk McLovin puts forward the argument that the way to discard false theses is if they're mutually exclusive. Okay, so what if both thesis and antithesis are false, but aren't mutually exclusive? What do we do in this scenario? Do we go ahead and synthesize them to reach a higher truth? I'll just let this clip play out. It really speaks for itself how ill-informed Funk McLovin is on the topic of Hegel and dialectics.
Dialectics can be a potent tool, but ultimately in real life it has mostly failed to bear any fruit as anything but a history-analyzing tool. It's not all-encompassing as Hegel would like it to be. It can seem almost liberal, a notion that at the core of any argument is a kernel of truth, when in reality there are some arguments that don't warrant discussion.
The work of Hegel is most valuable in seeing how these processes move, not from seeing the end result and creating an equation to replicate it. But Funk McLovin wouldn't know that because she's failed to grasp the very fundamentals of his work. And that is pretty much my main contentions with this video from Funk McLovin. I don't think this is an entirely serious video from her, but if you look in the comments, there are people saying how good of a resource this is for learning, despite it being very wrong. If you want actually good content on Hegel, I would advise you to read Hegel himself, and when you realize that it's boring and hard and you hate your life, I highly recommend you check out my goat, Antonio Wolf. He's running a channel far too small for the quality of the work he puts out, and has had a tremendous effect on my Hegelian journey. And then you should go back and read Hegel because it's absolutely fire. I may have another one or two of these shorter videos whilst I'm working on the Twin Peaks video. Just to give you an idea of how big it'll be, I've covered episode 1 and half of episode 2, and I'm at 14 pages written and almost 9,000 words, which is just over an hour of speaking time. Though websites like that typically overestimate how long you'll speak for, and there's 8 episodes in the season, so yay! Anyways, hope you have enjoyed. I have been Unijoy, and you have been entertained.